Despite its recent popularity, matcha is older than you might think, with a history going back over 2,000 years. Today's journey through matcha history will take us through tales of monks, samurai, and tea masters as we uncover the secret of Japan's most famous drink. This video is an excerpt from our book Matcha Masterclass, a 150-page guide on matcha tea. If you want to learn about how matcha is made, the health benefits of matcha, and how to identify low-quality versus high-quality matcha, you can get the book for free by clicking the link in the description below. Now let's get to the history of matcha. Up until the 1700s, ground tea was the most common form of tea consumption in Japan. It began as a drink for the monks and then gradually spread to every strata of Japanese society, to the aristocracy, followed by the samurai, then the merchants, and then finally to the common people. In this segment, we will observe the journey of matcha, from a medicinal drink drunk by only a few to a beverage enjoyed by the masses. 2nd century BCE, the earliest records of tea consumption in China. The earliest physical records of tea were found as recently as 2016 in the mausoleum of Emperor Jing of Han. This indicates that tea was consumed by the emperors as far back as the 2nd century BCE, with credible written records suggesting it was drunk much earlier. No one knows for sure when tea was first consumed as a stimulant, but in 220 AD, in a medical text, Shi Lun, by Hu Tao, stated, "To drink bitter too constantly makes one think better." This enhanced concentration provided by tea drinking made it very useful to the Chinese monks. 8th century AD, monks bring tea to Japan. Tea was beginning to spread all throughout China, even in the northern provinces. Liu Yu wrote The Classic of Tea in 760 to 762. Which described tea as a type of mania. It was during this time that the first centralized state in Japan was beginning to take form, with Nara as its first permanent capital. This is where the history of tea in Japan really began. The earliest records of tea consumption in Japan date back to the 8th century. It was common for Buddhist monks and diplomats to take trips to China and bring back cultural practices as well as literature and art to share with people in Japan. Tea was one of those practices that made its way from China to Japan. The monks Saicho, the founder of the Tendai sect of Buddhism, and Kukai, the founder of the Shingon sect, were credited as the first to bring tea to Japan from China. The monks were among the first to consume tea in early Japan, and they found that the tea helped them stay calm and alert during long periods of meditation. And even Emperor Saga was impressed by the drink, claiming it was a vehicle to the world of spirits and immortals. 9th century, tea becomes fashionable. Because China was seen as the epitome of culture and sophistication during this time, the Japanese aristocracy were all Sinophiles. Anything from the mainland was considered fashionable and helped to add to their prestige. At this time, tea was pressed into a dried brick, and pieces could be broken off and ground with a hagen mortar. Even though the tea was ground, it looked very different from the matcha of today. It was grainier, more bitter, and it would have had to have been sweetened or mixed with ginger for it to be palatable. The tea at this time likely looked more like a soup, and it was thought of as more of a medicine rather than a drink. Part of the reason for this was because the tea was so bitter and it tasted more like a healthy tonic or a medicinal brew. Monasteries became centers of tea trade. The monks needed to speak Chinese to read sutras and traveled to China somewhat frequently. The temples also needed a way to make a little extra money, so the tea trade was logical for them to get into. Tea was slowly imported from China to Japan, but nowhere near enough to keep up with the growing demand. 12th century, tea cultivation in Japan. The history of tea in Japan really began to get interesting once tea started being grown on the islands. Although there are records of tea being consumed in Japan as early as the 8th century, the first record of the plant being cultivated in Japan wasn't until 1191, when the monk Eisai brought back tea seeds from China and planted them on the grounds of Kozanji Temple outside of Kyoto in the Toganoo Mountains. 13th century, the samurai. The history of tea in Japan began to transition from the temples to the rest of the country. In 1211, Eisai wrote the book Kissa Yojiki on the health benefits of tea, and for the first time, people other than monks and emperors began to take notice. In 1214, Eisai introduced tea to the samurai class. The value of tea to the samurai was originally limited to helping cure their hangovers, but later they accepted it once they embraced the principles of Zen Buddhism. Tea and Zen Buddhism were often intertwined throughout history. Dogen even included notes on serving tea during Buddhist rituals, and Muso Soseki even stated that tea and Zen are one. The samurai also had another use for tea. By the 1100s, the samurai were becoming a major force in Japanese politics. The warrior class commanded a lot of military power, but also wanted to be viewed as culturally legitimate. Tea was still considered a sophisticated drink of the aristocrats and mainland, and therefore it was another way for them to build their prestige. It was here that tea trickled down to the next strata of Japanese society, the warrior class. And the timing was perfect, as there were some key innovations taking place in the tea industry that made the drink more palatable. 14th century, matcha begins to take form. During the early 1300s, the tea market in Japan was beginning to change. The Chausu, or tea grinder, was brought over from China by the 1310s at the latest. This grinder resembles the modern matcha mill, and compared to the yagen, it produced a much finer grind and smoother flavor. The color even became greener, and the tea was starting to be recognizable as matcha. The bamboo tea whisk, or chasen, was also introduced at this time, which made it easier to whisk up the tea. It was during this century that tea started to make the transition from medicine, or meditation aid, to a beverage that people actually wanted to drink. Toganoo emerged as the first tea brand, or appellation. This region was home to the first known tea plantation at Kozanji Temple, and because the hills provided the tea plants with partial shade, it produced excellent quality tea. This was Japan's first successful domestic tea region, and many only considered the tea to be true tea if it was grown here. Because tea was more palatable, tea parties began to emerge, and people began to develop a palate for fine tea. 15th century. Tea becomes a status symbol. In the 15th century, the tea industry saw its first boom, and plantations were sprouting up all across the country. Between the 700s and 1600, there is a record of 90 tea plantations in Japan, but half started just in the 200 years after 1397. Tea was considered a dietary staple at this time, and during the war, it was even listed in troop rations next to rice. Tea was also beginning to be transported all across the country, and now tea shops were beginning to spring up. Tea had begun to trickle down to the next strata of society, the merchant class, who could now afford to buy a bowl of tea if they wanted to. Despite its mass adoption, tea still did not fall out of favor with the aristocracy. Before the development of the modern tea ceremony, tea was seen as an opportunity for the upper classes to showcase their wealth. They held gatherings in opulent tea houses around Kyoto to showcase their exotic tea and teaware. This can be seen in the story of Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa, the primary resident of Ginkakuji, or the Silver Pavilion, outside of Kyoto. It was here that he hosted tea gatherings of the upper classes to showcase his knowledge of tea and his expensive teaware in a gold-plated tea room. This was the original form of the Japanese tea ceremony, but it would need to undergo a radical transformation in order to become what we recognize it as today. 16th century, the rise of Uji. It was during this century that Uji surpassed Toganoo as the epicenter of tea cultivation. Wealthy merchants like the Kanbayashi family began buying up plots of land and investing money into cultivating and covering the tea plants to produce better tasting tea. This shading process, which produces smoother and sweeter teas, was likely only being used in Uji at the time, which gave the region a big advantage. It was also during the 1500s that Sen no Rikyu became one of the most influential figures in Japanese tea, with his philosophies leading to the modern Japanese tea ceremony. Matcha was still the dominant form of tea at the time, so it was used in the tea ceremony, securing it a spot as the most famous Japanese tea today. 1740, the switch to leaf tea. Between the 1500s and 1600s, matcha was the primary way to consume green tea in Japan. But that all changed with the invention of Nagatani Soen. This tea grower in Uji discovered that rather than grinding the tea leaves into a powder, they could be steamed, rolled, and dried to maintain their flavor for long periods of time. They could then be prepared in a teapot and poured into a cup. This discovery allowed Nagatani Soen to popularize the use of Sencha tea, which is now by far the most common type of green tea in Japan. Edo period. The Tokugawa shogunate took control over Japan and ushered in 2.5 centuries of peace. During this time, the population grew rapidly and economic prosperity followed soon after. This period of peace greatly benefited the tea industry, as tea was easier to transport without the threat of banditry, and more people could afford to drink it. Mid-19th century, tea production becomes more industrialized. In the mid-19th century, the Tokugawa shogunate fell, which gave rise to the imperial rule of Japan. During this time, there were great improvements in maritime shipping, which led both to the export of Japanese tea abroad, as well as the incorporation of industrial farming techniques in the US and Europe. This is where tea farming became more industrialized, similar to what you might find on a modern Japanese tea farm. Tea could be harvested, processed, and packaged all in one place. Other than the Dutch trading small amounts of tea from Nagasaki in the 1600s, this would be the first time Japanese tea made it to the US and Europe. 20th century, boom and bust. By 1925, 50% of Japanese tea was being exported to the US, but those exports would soon decline from this peak thanks to 3 major factors: the Great Depression in the United States, which led to a decrease in purchasing power, cheaper alternatives from Sri Lanka and China beginning to emerge, and economic tensions between the US and Japan and the subsequent world wars. It was from here that the tea industry began to turn inward once again and focus on the domestic market. Tea was made for the Japanese palate, and exports shrank to almost zero after the Second World War. 21st century, matcha goes global. Matcha is now getting a revival in the 21st century. While only 6% of Japanese tea is sold abroad, as of 2023, 50% of matcha tea was now being exported outside of Japan. In 2024, news of a matcha shortage began to make headlines. With an ever-increasing demand, farmers cannot keep up. With a shortage of farmers, tea plants, and specialized machinery, it's likely that the matcha shortage will persist for the next few years at least. If you want to learn more about the matcha shortage and the realities facing the tea industry today, you can watch our video where we cover it in greater detail. But don't worry too much about the shortage. After working with talented farmers around Japan for a decade, we have built strong relationships, and we will still be able to provide everyone with great tasting matcha tea. If you want to sample a few different matcha teas at once and see what you like, you can try our matcha samplers at neoteas.com. In the next video, we'll talk about the Japanese tea ceremony, but if you don't want to wait that long, you can get the full book today. Just sign up to our newsletter using the link below and we'll send you a copy. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons so you can see the next video as soon as it comes out. Until then, we'll see you next time.